The rise of Reform UK under Nigel Farage has sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. It's not the first time there's been a minor party that's looked as if it's going to break into the two-party system and queer the pitch. But Farage particularly has exposed the ineffectiveness of the two-party leaders, the intellectual deficiencies, the strategic failures, the sheer incompetence of both the Labour Party and the Conservatives. And when Farage, a man whose entire career has been built on demagogy, on media theatrics and chicanery, somehow appears the most statesmanlike figure in the landscape, it speaks volumes, doesn't it, about the inadequacies of his opponents. Both Labour and the Conservatives recognise that Reform UK is a growing problem. I mean, how could they not recognise that fact? And Labour, at the very least, has grasped the importance of undermining Reform UK on policy, while the Conservatives appear parallels because they're led by a twit, desperately scrambling to reclaim ground by mimicking Farage rather than challenging him. And Labour has identified the Achilles heel of Reform UK, healthcare. Farage's past statements about moving towards an insurance-based model, eerily reminiscent of the American system, are political dynamite. The point is that we have an insurance model in the healthcare system in the UK, and it doesn't work either. Labour strategists understand that. For all the anti-immigration rhetoric that binds the reform base, the NHS remains sacrosanct for the British electorate. The mere suggestion that Farage would dismantle free at the point of use healthcare is enough to send his supporters into a defensive frenzy. Indeed, the sheer volume of Reform voters attempting to deny Farage's position is indicative of their fear of this line of attack. Yet Labour's problem is one of communication. Their strategy may be effective in theory, but they lack the sharp oratorical skills necessary to capitalise on it, or at least Keir Starmer does. Keir Starmer, for all his legal acumen, is incapable of delivering the kind of rhetoric needed to cut through. When your chief opponent is a populist who thrives on sound bites, you need a charismatic counterweight. And instead, Labour offers a man who could turn even the most damning attack line into a dry procedural footnote. Well, Keir Starmer simply sums up the country at the moment, more obsessed with bureaucracy than burdened with insight. And meanwhile, the Conservatives are busy making two catastrophic errors in their attempt to combat Reform UK. First, they refuse to attack Farage and his party on character, and they're more than happy to sling mud at Labour, but when it comes to reform, there's an inexplicable reluctance to go for the jugular. The Tories could easily highlight Farage's inconsistency, his past failures in UKIP, his habit of treating politics as a side hustle while cashing in on media gigs and advertising gold bullion. They could point to Richard Tice's laughable attempt to deny wearing a watch, a gaffe that speaks volumes about his credibility. Yet, rather than to discredit Reform's leadership, they shy away, seemingly in awe or perhaps in fear of Farage. Second, the Conservatives have chosen to challenge Reform UK on immigration, a move so politically suicidal that it's difficult to comprehend. Immigration is Farage's bread and butter. He spent decades refining his message, crafting the precise lines that resonate with the disaffected voter. Trying to outflank Farage on immigration is akin to challenging Roger Federer to a game of tennis and expecting to win by sheer bravado. It's a fight the Tories cannot possibly succeed in, and yet they continue to throw themselves into it with reckless abandon. Brace! Brace! And then we have Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, who was this morning skewered on national television by Richard Madeley, of all people, over inconsistencies in her CV. Well, this is an old story. The fact that this was allowed to happen at all demonstrates the Labour Party's fundamental lack of preparation. Reform UK thrives on presenting themselves as the anti-establishment alternative, railing against politicians who are perceived as deceitful or incompetent. And when Labour's key economic figure is caught exaggerating her credentials, it plays directly into Farage's hands. The idea that a party so desperate to restore economic credibility could not foresee such an obvious line of attack is staggering. And despite the failings of his opponents, Farage isn't invincible. Farage isn't invincible. His pro-Russian leanings, his willingness to echo Kremlin talking points in NATO and Ukraine, his frequent absences from the country, his financial ties to interests that would benefit from NHS privatisation are all areas ripe for attack. The problem is that neither Labour nor the Conservatives seem willing to or able to exploit these weaknesses. Labour, despite having the best strategy on paper, suffers from poor execution and from lame presentation. The Conservatives, by contrast, are floundering with no coherent strategy at all, led by somebody who sounds as if she's from a sort of 1970s aeroplane disaster movie. Brace! Brace! It's going to be a disaster! Waging battles they cannot possibly win while refusing to engage in the ones that they can win. And in this political vacuum, Farage thrives. Like those germs in the Vincent Price advert, just under the rim, gets under the rim. Doesn't Farage, he gets under the rim. Oh no, I'm getting under the rim now. Sounds a bit like Kenneth Williams. But the reality is that Farage's appeal is not built on policy, but on the ability to articulate frustration in a way that mainstream politicians simply cannot. And as long as Labour or the Conservatives continue to underestimate him, one through incompetence, the other through cowardice, Reform UK will continue to siphon votes from both. And if the political establishment is serious about stopping Farage, it must do more than panic. It must attack where he's weakest, communicate with precision, and perhaps most crucially, learn how to speak the language of the electorate. Until then, we're all doomed to the absurdity of a political landscape where Nigel Farage appears to be the most coherent figure in the room.